In the heart of downtown, where the morning fog rolls off the harbor and mingles with the exhaust of police cruisers, stands the 5th Precinct. Its brick facade has weathered decades of storms, witnessed countless arrests, and housed generations of officers who swore to serve and protect. But if you walk through its corridors today, you'll notice something peculiar in the lobby. A bronze plaque that wasn't there 25 years ago. Most rookies walk past it without a second glance. But the veterans, they stop. They read those words etched in metal, and they remember a time when justice wasn't so clear-cut, when loyalty was tested, and when one man's refusal to bend became the stuff of legend. This is the story of Detective Frank Mendez. A story that begins not with heroics, but with whispers. For 2 decades, they believed he was corrupt. His name became a curse whispered in the shadows of the precinct locker room. New recruits would hear fragments, stories told in hushed tones during night shifts, warnings passed down like folklore. Don't end up like Mendez, they'd say. Don't let the job corrupt you. Detective Frank Mendez. The name hung in the air like smoke from a dead cigarette. In the precinct's Hall of Honor, where photographs of decorated officers lined the walls in perfect rows, his picture sat crooked, if it was displayed at all. Sometimes it would disappear for months, only to reappear in a different spot, as if the building itself couldn't decide whether to honor or forget him. He had been decorated once, 3 commendations for bravery, 2 citations for exceptional service, a medal for saving a family from a burning building on Christmas Eve, 1995. The newspapers called him the People's Detective. Citizens would stop him on the street to shake his hand. Children would wave from school buses when his patrol car passed by. But that was before the allegations, before the investigation, before the fall from grace that would define not just his legacy, but the very soul of the 5th Precinct. They said he took bribes, envelopes thick with cash passed across dimly lit parking lots. They said he covered up crimes, evidence that mysteriously vanished, witnesses who suddenly forgot what they saw. They said he walked out of internal affairs without a word, his badge and gun left on the desk like discarded pieces of a broken life. The truth was simpler and infinitely more complex. Frank Mendez never defended himself. He just vanished. It started with Operation Clean Sweep, the biggest drug bust in the city's history. 6 months of surveillance, dozens of undercover operations, and a web of dealers that stretched from the docks to the suburbs. Detective Mendez was the lead investigator, the man who had painstakingly built the case brick by brick, witness by witness. The morning of the arrest, everything was perfect. Search warrants signed, SWAT teams positioned, district attorney's office standing by. The media had been tipped off. This was going to be the arrest that would make careers and clean up the streets. But then, like a house of cards in a hurricane, it all fell apart. The key suspect, Carlos Vega, walked free. Not on a technicality, not because of a lawyer's clever argument. He walked free because the evidence that should have condemned him simply wasn't there anymore. Fingerprints that had been carefully cataloged and stored, gone. Surveillance photos that clearly showed faces, suddenly blank. Audio recordings that captured deals being made, nothing but static. The evidence room had experienced what the department officially called a system glitch. Temperature controls had malfunctioned. Humidity had spiked. Digital files had corrupted. Physical evidence had degraded beyond recognition. It was, according to the official report, an act of God. But God, as Detective Mendez knew, didn't usually have keys to the evidence room. All eyes pointed to him. He was the lead investigator. He had access. He had motive. At least, that's what the whispers suggested. Maybe Vega had gotten to him. Maybe the money had been too good to refuse. Maybe the pressure had finally broken the man they once called the People's Detective. The internal affairs investigation was swift and brutal. Mendez was suspended pending review. His badge was confiscated. His gun was locked away. His desk was searched, his locker emptied, his phone records subpoenaed. They found nothing incriminating, but in the world of police politics, the absence of evidence can be just as damning as its presence. The media descended like vultures. Dirty cop destroys drug case. From hero to zero. The rise and fall of Detective Frank Mendez. The same newspapers that had once celebrated him now dissected his every move, his every decision, his every moment of doubt. His partner, Detective Sarah Chen, had worked with him for 8 years. They had saved each other's lives more times than either could count. They had shared coffee during stakeouts, stories during long drives, and a friendship that had weathered every storm the job could throw at them. But on the day Frank Mendez walked out of the 5th Precinct for the last time, Detective Chen refused to shake his hand. She stood in the doorway watching him go, her face a mask of disappointment and betrayal. She never spoke to him again. The department fired him without ceremony. No trial, no press conference, no opportunity for defense. Just a letter in the mail and a pension stripped away. The official statement was 3 sentences long. Detective Frank Mendez has been terminated for conduct unbecoming an officer. The department does not tolerate corruption in any form. We remain committed to serving the public with integrity and honor. The media called him the Rat. The nickname stuck. What happens to a police officer when he's no longer a police officer? What happens to a man whose entire identity, whose whole sense of purpose has been stripped away in the course of a single devastating week? For Frank Mendez, what happened was 20 years of exile. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't hire a lawyer. He didn't give interviews or write tell-all books or appear on television to proclaim his innocence. He simply disappeared, as if he had never existed at all. The city moved on. New cases were opened and closed. New officers were hired and promoted. The 5th Precinct got a fresh coat of paint, new computers, updated equipment. Carlos Vega was arrested 2 years later on different charges and sent to prison for life. The drug trade continued, as it always had, adapting and evolving and finding new ways to flourish in the shadows. But sometimes, late at night, when the old-timers were sharing stories over drinks at Murphy's bar, someone would ask, "Whatever happened to Frank Mendez?" The answers varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said he had moved to Mexico, living off money he had skimmed from drug dealers. Others insisted he had drunk himself to death, unable to cope with the shame of his disgrace. A few claimed to have seen him working construction jobs in other cities, using a different name, trying to forget who he used to be. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the rumors. Frank Mendez had indeed disappeared, but he hadn't gone far. He lived in a small trailer on the outskirts of town, in a park where nobody asked questions and everybody minded their own business. He worked odd jobs, landscaping, house painting, furniture moving. He changed his name to Frank Martinez and kept his head down and his mouth shut. He didn't drink himself to death, though there were nights when the temptation was strong. He didn't flee to Mexico, though the thought had crossed his mind more than once. He didn't write angry letters to newspapers or try to clear his name through social media or attempt to contact his old colleagues. He waited. What was he waiting for? Even he wasn't entirely sure. Justice, perhaps. Vindication. Or maybe just for the right person to ask the right questions and look in the right places. 20 years is a long time to wait. Long enough for the city to change, for new buildings to rise and old ones to fall. Long enough for an entire generation of police officers to retire and be replaced by men and women who had never heard the name Frank Mendez. Long enough for the story to become legend and the legend to become myth. But Frank Mendez was patient. He had learned patience in the trailer park, in the odd jobs, in the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the weight of his ruined reputation pressed down on him like a physical thing. He had learned to wait. Officer Camila Reyes was 26 years old and had been with the 5th Precinct for exactly 8 months when she was assigned to archive duty. It was, she knew, the kind of job they gave to rookies. Tedious, thankless work that nobody else wanted to do. She was supposed to digitize old case files, organize evidence boxes, and create a database that would make the department's records more accessible to modern investigators. It was boring work, but Camilla approached it with the same dedication she brought to everything else. She had wanted to be a police officer since she was 12 years old, inspired by a detective who had helped her family through a difficult time. She wasn't about to let a mundane assignment diminish her enthusiasm for the job. The basement of the 5th Precinct was a maze of storage rooms, each one filled with boxes and filing cabinets and the accumulated detritus of decades of police work. Some of the boxes were labeled clearly, with case numbers and dates and detailed inventories. Others were marked with cryptic codes that seemed to make sense only to whoever had written them. And a few, like the one Camilla found on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, had no markings at all. It was a standard evidence box, the kind used for storing physical evidence and important documents. But unlike the others, this one was sealed with evidence tape that had never been broken. No case number, no date, no indication of what might be inside or why it had been stored in the first place. Camilla almost put it back. Protocol dictated that unmarked boxes should be reported to a supervisor before being opened. But something about this particular box nagged at her. It was placed differently than the others, almost as if it had been hidden. And when she lifted it, she could hear something shifting inside. Not the rustle of papers, but the weight of something more substantial. She made a decision that would change everything. She opened the box. Inside, wrapped in clear plastic evidence bags, were 3 items. A VHS tape, labeled only with a date, March 15th, 1999. A typed letter, addressed to whoever finds this first. And a police badge, wrapped carefully in a piece of blue cloth. But it was the note attached to the inside of the box lid that made Camilla's heart race. Written in careful block letters, it contained a single sentence. If you're reading this, it means someone finally looked deeper. The VHS tape was old, and the precinct's equipment was older. Camilla had to search through 3 different storage rooms before she found a television and VCR that still worked. She set them up in an empty interrogation room, closed the door, and pressed play. The quality was poor, grainy, with the kind of interference that came from a hidden camera or a recording device pushed beyond its limits. But the audio was clear enough, and the images, while fuzzy, were unmistakable. The tape showed a storage room, not unlike the ones in the basement where Camilla had found the box. 2 men were talking, their voices echoing off concrete walls. One was younger, maybe in his 30s, with dark hair and the kind of build that came from years of physical training. The other was older, gray-haired, wearing a suit that suggested authority and power. Camilla recognized them both from photographs she had seen in the precinct's Hall of Honor. The younger man was Detective Frank Mendez, 20 years younger than in the crooked photograph upstairs. The older man was Commander William Morrison, who had been Mendez's supervisor and who had publicly led the investigation into the corruption charges. Morrison was speaking, his voice calm and measured, but with an underlying tone of menace that made Camilla's skin crawl. "This is how it's going to work, Frank. The Vega case goes away. The evidence disappears. The witnesses forget what they saw. And you forget everything you think you know about who's been protecting the operation." Mendez's response was immediate and unwavering. "I won't do it. You will, or your career is over. We have enough circumstantial evidence to make you look dirty. A few missing receipts here, some unexplained cash deposits there. Maybe some witnesses who remember seeing you in places you shouldn't have been. It's amazing how creative people can be when they're properly motivated. You're talking about framing me for crimes I didn't commit. I'm talking about protecting an operation that's bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than this entire department. The people I work for don't like loose ends, Frank. They don't like Boy Scouts who can't see the bigger picture." The camera captured everything. Morrison's threats, his casual admission of corruption, his detailed explanation of how the evidence in the Vega case would be destroyed. And it captured Mendez's response, his refusal to participate, his insistence that he would rather lose his job than compromise his integrity. "You want me to shut up?" Mendez said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Fire me, destroy my reputation, do whatever you have to do, but I won't lie. I won't cover up crimes, and I won't let you turn me into something I'm not." The tape ended with Mendez carefully placing a folder into an evidence box. The same box, Camilla realized, that she had found in the basement. His last act as a police officer had been to preserve the truth, even knowing that it might never be discovered. Camilla Reyes faced a choice that would define her career and possibly her life. She could put the tape back in the box, seal it up, and pretend she had never found it. She could protect herself, protect the department, protect the status quo that had survived for 20 years. Or she could do what Frank Mendez had done: refuse to lie, refuse to cover up, refuse to let corruption triumph over truth. She chose truth. The tape went public on a Thursday morning. Camilla had made copies, stored them in multiple locations, and contacted a reporter she trusted. By noon, every news station in the city was playing excerpts. By evening, the story had gone national. The 5th Precinct was in chaos. Commissioner Angela Davis, who had been a young officer when Mendez was fired, called an emergency press conference. Standing at the podium where so many lies had been told, she spoke the words that Frank Mendez had waited 20 years to hear. "We were wrong. We failed Detective Frank Mendez. We failed the public. We failed ourselves." Commander Morrison had died 5 years earlier, taking his secrets with him. But the investigation that followed revealed the scope of the corruption he had overseen. 2 current officers were arrested. 3 others resigned in disgrace. The entire command structure of the Narcotics Division was replaced. Detective Sarah Chen, now a lieutenant, watched the press conference from her office. She had spent 20 years wondering if she had been wrong about her former partner. Now she knew. She put her head in her hands and wept for the friendship she had thrown away. and the good man she had failed to defend. A reporter from Channel 7, the same station that had dubbed Mendez the Rat, broke down in tears during a live broadcast. "We got it all wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "We destroyed a good man. We participated in a lie that ruined an innocent person's life. I don't know how we live with that, but the vindication had come too late. Frank Mendez was nowhere to be found. Camila Reyes knew she had to find him. She had uncovered the truth, but the story wasn't complete until she could tell Frank Mendez that his name had been cleared, that his reputation had been restored, that the 20 years of exile were finally over. She found the trailer park on a Saturday afternoon, using property records and utility bills to track down the man who had been living as Frank Martinez. The trailer was small and neat, with a tiny garden and a mailbox that bore no name. But when she knocked on the door, no one answered. The neighbors were friendly, but not particularly helpful. They remembered Frank, quiet man, kept to himself, did good work when you hired him for odd jobs. But they hadn't seen him in weeks, maybe months. Time moved differently in the trailer park. The door was unlocked. Inside, the trailer was clean and sparse, with the kind of order that came from a life stripped down to its essentials. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal mementos, no indication of who Frank Mendez had been before he became Frank Martinez. But on the small kitchen table, there was an envelope addressed to Officer Reyes. Inside, a letter written in the same careful block letters that had been on the evidence box. "Officer Reyes, I knew this day would come. Not because I had faith in the system, but because I had faith in people like you. People who ask questions. People who dig deeper. People who refuse to accept easy answers. I wasn't waiting for justice. Justice is what happens in courtrooms and newspapers and press conferences. I was waiting for truth. And truth is what happens when someone cares enough to look beyond the surface, to question the narrative, to seek the real story. You found the truth. Now maybe you can fix what's left. The department needs people like you, people who won't be corrupted, people who won't be intimidated, people who understand that the badge means something, that the oath means something, that the public trust is not something to be bought and sold. Keep your badge clean, Reyes. Keep asking questions. Keep looking deeper. And remember Frank Mendez not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to bend. The city needs more cops like you. Don't let them turn you into something you're not. Frank Mendez was posthumously reinstated to the force with full honors. Badge number 214, which had been retired in disgrace, was ceremonially returned to service and then retired again, this time with honor. A bronze plaque was placed in the lobby of the 5th Precinct, where every officer entering the building would see it. The plaque reads, "Detective Frank Mendez, Badge 214. He refused to lie. They called him dirty, but he was the cleanest of them all. Keep your badge clean." But the real legacy of Frank Mendez wasn't carved in bronze or written in official reports. It lived in the stories that were told to new recruits, in the example that was set by officers who remembered his sacrifice, in the culture of integrity that slowly began to take root in the department. Officer Camila Reyes was promoted to detective 6 months later. She kept the letter from Frank Mendez in her desk drawer, and sometimes when faced with difficult decisions, she would take it out and read it again. "Keep your badge clean," he had written. "Keep asking questions. Keep looking deeper." She did. The 5th Precinct became known as one of the most honest departments in the state. New officers were told the story of Frank Mendez on their first day, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of corruption, but as an inspiration about the power of integrity. And sometimes, late at night, when the old-timers gathered at Murphy's bar to share stories and remember the past, someone would raise a glass to the empty stool at the end of the bar, the one where Frank Mendez used to sit, back when he was still the people's detective. To Frank, they would say, the cleanest cop who ever wore the badge. The city had learned finally that some things are worth more than money, more than career advancement, more than the approval of corrupt superiors. Some things, like truth, like integrity, like the refusal to bend in the face of pressure, are worth 20 years of exile, worth a ruined reputation, worth everything a person has to give. Frank Mendez had given everything. And in the end, his sacrifice had meant something. The legend of Detective Frank Mendez lived on, not in the whispers of shame, but in the example of courage. And every day in the lobby of the 5th Precinct, officers would pass by his plaque and remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to lie, even when it costs you everything, even when nobody believes you, even when you have to wait 20 years for the truth to come out. Detective Frank Mendez had kept his badge clean, and in doing so, he had shown others how to keep theirs clean too. That was his legacy. That was his gift to the city he had served. That was the legend that would never die.